Good morning, all, and welcome back to a rambling discussion with Charlie and Paul. Charlie, it's so good to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you too. How's your week been?
Great, Charlie. Yeah, I had such a good week. We went up to Syracuse to see the solar eclipse, which was wild and fantastic at the same time. And we also went to a great tech meetup here in New York, and it was so invigorating to see so many entrepreneurs and startups bring energy to the room. So overall, a wonderful week.
Very cool. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I had kind of an interesting week. I someone at work accused me of being overly optimistic about something, which is it's not a quality that I think I've really have. I think I'm more of a pragmatist or pessimist probably, and it kind of got me thinking a little bit about like as leaders, is it better to be optimistic or pessimistic or realists? Like, just wanted to kind of like open it up for us to talk about. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as a person, I certainly lean more toward optimism and always have. And as a leader earlier in my career, that's essentially the philosophy that I brought to work, right? Be optimistic, ensure that I push that out to the rest of my team and we can solve for any challenge that's put in front of us. I think that's evolved over the last good number of years, Charlie, to the point where there's nuance to it. I feel like I set audacious goals. I ensure that we've got, the platforms and tools we need to achieve those goals. But in regards to reaching those goals, I find myself more of a realist, right? A clear-eyed thinker in terms of the obstacles that stand in front of us. And that mindset came to me from a book I read quite recently, where there was an individual by the name of Jim Stockdale. He was the highest ranking American soldier held captive during the Vietnam War. He was a POW in the camp known as Hanoi Hilton. So he spent 7 years enduring horrific treatment in the camp on a mission to help as many fellow soldiers return as is possible. So Jim Collins, the author of this book, Good to Great, asked him, quite recently, or many, many years after he was held captive, what helped him endure those difficult times. And what Stockdale said was realism helped him, right? So he said some in the camp were overly optimistic. They would say we're going to get out by Christmas or by Easter. Christmas and Easter would come and pass, and they would effectively lose hope. So their optimism crushed them. The realists, on the other hand, faced the brutal facts and reality that was in front of them, but they also believed that they would prevail, which is really, really important as a leader and an individual. Have that resilience and that confidence that you will prevail, you will hit the goals, but make sure you're clear-eyed in terms of the challenges that you face and not overly optimistic for fear that missing those goals will crush your optimism and the optimism of your team over time. So I think it's a nuanced answer, Charlie. I think there's value in being an optimist and a realist, and it's very case dependent. What are your thoughts on it, Charlie?
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. I tend to not be overly optimistic because I always think of the worst case scenario because I'm a product manager. So like that's like what I have to do is look out for things that may go wrong. Being overly optimistic as a leader, I think can get you in a lot of trouble when when you take it to the extreme across like all parts of the business and where you're going. So if you look at Boeing, for example, right, they implemented a whole bunch of cost cutting measures over the past decade, and there was an overly optimistic view that they wouldn't actually need some of these safety standards or prioritizing those types of things, et cetera. And they've ended up in a really, really bad spot. And it's incredibly disturbing that like that the optimism that we can build planes and we can do it in a way that saves money without respect to kind of like the pragmatism, the realism, the pessimism of like no things go wrong all of the time. You end up in a really, really dangerous situation. And so they significantly underestimated the risks that led to all kinds of issues with their planes. A bunch of their fleet's been grounded at this point. Leadership changes are happening. See, this person's getting, CEOs getting pushed out, albeit with a golden parachute. But I do think that's a really kind of clear cut example of like how unfettered optimism can lead to like really big, really dangerous things.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and especially today as we're seeing, this airline go through such challenges. On the other side of it, and I don't think it's a counterpoint, but it speaks to the importance of audacious leadership. And as I was, thinking through this topic through the week, Steve Jobs came to mind because Steve Jobs was such an audacious leader. So the Boeing example for sure brings home the fact that unfettered optimism without risk management has incredible long-term downsides for the organization, especially when it's putting people's lives at risk. What Steve Jobs did was interesting, though. Steve Jobs had this philosophy, and it was, in some regards, unconscious, but it was the distortion reality field, where Steve Jobs was known across Apple for having expectations that the rest of the organization felt were completely impossible to achieve. His co-founder, Steve Wozniak, said that Jobs' reality distortion is when he has an illogical vision of the future, such as telling Wozniak that he could design the breakout game in just a few days. Wozniak said that you realize that it can't be true. You know that it's impossible, but somehow Jobs, as a leader, makes it true. Not just philosophically, but by believing it, brings the organization along on that journey to achieve what they wouldn't have achieved otherwise. So the way I think about this now, Charlie, is that it's really important to have audacious leaders. It's really important to set audacious goals. But it's also critically important that you measure the risks and you understand the reality in which you exist as you try to achieve those goals, so that the downside impact of not hitting those very audacious goals doesn't necessarily manifest in a downside to the overall organization.
So what you're basically saying is that it's important to have audacious goals, which are more related to kind of like point in time accomplishments. But optimism is more of the process, the culture, the ethos that ultimately like drives the organization to accomplish those audacious goals.
Precisely. Absolutely.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it also, it really makes me think about the fact that it's not being an optimistic leader or a pessimistic leader or a realistic leader, like point blanket statement is the thing. It is a lot more nuanced than that, right? And I think you really need to look, as leaders, it's incredibly important to understand what what which things to look at within an optimistic lens, right? So during times of change, like some big market event just happened and the company's going through turmoil. So being overly optimistic about what the future, it's kind of like imbuing the company with a culture of hope and like we can do this. In innovation and growth, you gave a great example of kind of what Steve Jobs did. Really kind of like dreaming big to come up to something that's like part of the way there. A great place to be optimistic. Building team morale, facing setbacks. I think those two things as well, like being optimistic has its place for sure. Where it doesn't make sense is I think risk management is probably the largest category of where having unfettered optimism can get you into a ton of trouble. Boeing is an example of that, but the application of you know lax risk management in financial institutions and health institutions and like the food that gets manufactured has huge implications on the health and the safety of the public, versus being excited or optimistic about like a new device that you're building. Not as impactful if it goes sideways. Being It also doesn't make sense to be overly optimistic if you're being criticized or if you're getting constructive feedback. So if the people in your company are telling you some kind of constructive feedback and you're kind of saying, oh, they'll get over it because they're great people and we have a great culture, you're ignoring reality. And there's real value. Like, I'm not going to go out and get on a soapbox about the importance of listening to constructive feedback, assimilating it, and then moving forward. But I do think like unfettered optimism can get in the way of really taking those things in because you're just like, oh no, it's going to totally work itself out. I don't need to worry about that. And with most things in life, the answer is I think it depends.
Right, for sure. And it seems to be the theme of these conversations each week, Charlie. I feel like we're in an environment now where it's quite binary. Individuals will choose a path or another, look for bias to back up that path. Where what we're learning week in, week out is that there's nuance to almost every one of these discussions. I think one thing to add to what you just put forth, Charlie, is that as we encounter overly optimistic leaders who aren't necessarily clear-eyed about the reality which in which their company exists, I believe that erodes trust in leaders. So from an experience perspective, and I've certainly at times been that leader, if we're not incredibly transparent and aware of the environment in which we exist, and we're putting on this overly optimistic view of the outlook of an organization, over time, that can erode trust in those leaders. And it's something to be mindful of. Use the contextual advice that you've just provided to bring optimism to an organization when it makes sense, but to be incredibly clear-eyed about the challenges that the organization faces. And to make this real, over the last number of years, I've been running Stockdale Paradox working sessions with my leaders in organizations to really manifest that as a culture. Where are we today? What are the goals that we want to hit? And what are the significant headwinds that we face in order to make the right decisions as an organization?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that all makes a ton of sense. I also follow and I agree that like based on the other conversations we've had, it really is living in the gray, right?
Yeah.
I think I think just as like a society, we like to like lean into a binary of I should be optimistic, I should be pessimistic, it should be this, it should be that. But the reality is, as leaders, because you're the leader, you have to be comfortable to modulate, to adapt, and to kind of like understand the context and circumstances that may lead you to be some way in this circumstances and another way in these other circumstances. Leading in the gray is something that I think is really, really challenging. But based on the conversations we've been having, like it's a theme that keeps coming up over and over. So that
Yeah.
all sounds.
Absolutely. And there's one thing we didn't touch on, actually, Charlie, and that's the pessimistic leader, right? So at the top, I believe you asked, optimism versus realism versus pessimism. I don't believe there's a strong place for pessimistic leaders. I think it's really important to be clear-eyed and understand the challenges that we face. And I read a really good book a couple of years ago, The Culture Code, and it talks about the negative impact that pessimistic individuals can have on the culture of a team, of an organization, or of any societal group. So I don't know if you fundamentally agree with that or not, but I do think that it's important to be conservative. It's important to understand the challenges that we face. But pessimism to me brings a very, very different mindset and culture to team performance, which typically can drag that performance and make it very difficult to succeed.
Yeah, I totally agree with you in that pessimism as a leader can be a huge problem and be very detrimental to the organization. But the million dollar question is really where is the line between realism and pessimism, pragmatism, and worst case scenario? And I think that's probably a conversation for another time.
Agreed, agreed. We could talk about this all day, Charlie. Fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed it as always, Charlie. And to our listeners, please do ping myself and or Charlie if you'd like to discuss this in more detail. And stay tuned for our next bi-weekly discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us once again. And Charlie, thank you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, sir. You too. Bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.